Hello, welcome to Australia and welcome to Australian Book Travels. Today, my intention is to begin a new format in how I show you and recommend to you any authors or books. In previous videos, I've tended to rush through a couple of authors at a time, trying to get the recommendations out there to you and get you to enjoy the books as much as I do. But I think it's far more beneficial for you and easier for me if we just look at one author at a time and perhaps one of their books or a series of their books. So today we begin a new format for looking at our books and our authors. I want to take you back approximately 130 years, if I have my calculations correct, somewhere there, to 1877. An Australian author and illustrator who was born in England. Any thoughts? She may not be as popular today as she was. Giving you any hints? Well, I'm talking about Cecilia May Gibbs, known around the world as May Gibbs. So May became famous through her Gumnut Babies and her Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie books. This is one of them that I have. This is a black and white, no watercolour illustrations. She was famous for her single line drawings and her colour illustrations, her watercolour. This is just a black and white version. It's a cheaper book. I bought it so that I could read the stories again. This was not that expensive at all. This one also not expensive, but it is her bedtime stories by Mrs. Kookaburra, and these do have her illustrations. But I'd like to show you this in detail a little bit later. First, I'd like to give you a little bit of information or history on May. So May was born, as we've established, in England in 1877 to two wonderful parents, artistic parents. Her father a cartoonist, her mother an illustrator. She then, with her parents, emigrated to Australia. Well, in actual fact, she and her mother followed her father. At the time of immigration, unfortunately, little May, who was approximately 4, I think she contracted chickenpox or something similar, so she couldn't travel. So her father came out first and settled in South Australia on farmland. The intent was for them to farm. By the time May and her mother came out to Australia some months later, May's mother, also named Cecilia Gibbs, was pregnant and with her second child and had the little boy Ivan, gave birth to him on the ship coming over to Australia, which must have been extremely hard in those days when you think that was 1880, 1881. Not an easy thing for women to do, but on her own. So, and with a small child. So really should be applauded, really. But by the time they arrived, they had a new baby, and they all settled as a family of 4 in South Australia. By the time May was about 8, her parents realised that farming wasn't for them. So for whatever reason, perhaps for work or maybe for better for the children, their education, I'm not sure why, but they did up sticks and settled in Perth in Western Australia. And by this time, May was about 8, and her father gave her a pony. Lucky May, but she was given a pony. And with this pony, she travelled out almost daily into the Australian bush. And it was here that May's story really begins for us, because on her expeditions and adventures out in the bush with her pony, she discovered that, or not only did she discover the Australian flora and fauna, but she discovered how much she loved it and began drawing the bush. And of course, in a young person's mind, her imagination thankfully ran wild, and she anthropomorphized the bush. So she humanized the flora and the fauna. And over that time, eventually that would morph into her Gumnut Baby stories, but we'll discuss that a little bit further on. So with her single line drawings and her watercolours, she began her artistic career, I guess we could say, and at the age of 15, won her first major prize, art prize, at a competition in Western Australia. From there, I think May realised that she really wanted it to be her career. It was her life. And so at the age of about 23, in 1900, she travelled back to London in order to attend an art school to obviously develop her skills, to develop them into a better technique and things like that. Thankfully for us, again. And unfortunately became unwell while she was over there and had to travel back to Australia. She did this a couple of times. She became unwell in England. I believe it was because she was such a hard worker that she overexerted herself and became unwell and then had to travel back to recuperate. But by the time, I think of about 1909, she qualified, she finished her schooling. I think she actually qualified with first class honours in her art class. Not easy to say. First class pass, not honours, first class pass in her art class. And came back to Australia. In that time, she was writing and illustrating for a number of publications. One of them was for a publication in Western Australia called Kodak, or Serial Kodak, I think it was. So she has begun a career, but it's not completely to her liking. It's not completely where she wants to be. So she ends up going back to England and finds herself a literary agent. It was there that she then really published her first books. And they were well known, they became well known and were published in America and England, but strangely enough, not in Australia. So she returned to Australia eventually, and I think that may have been 1913 it was. She returned to her family home in Western Australia, but along with her good friend Renee, decided that Sydney was the place to be, where perhaps she could really take her career off in Australia. So she and Renee travelled to Sydney, and in that time there's still publishing going on with different magazines and some local magazines. She did become I think it was Australia's first female political cartoonist as well, which was quite a feat. But anyway, I digress for a minute. She then at that time, while still drawing and setting up her own stories, her own children's stories, she meets a gentleman by the name of Bertram James Osole Kelly, known as Bertie, and eventually ends up marrying him in 1919, I think it was. They remained in Sydney, the two of them, when they were married, and built their own home in Sydney and named it Nutcote, presumably after the Gumnut Babies, who that by this time had been published and were making quite a scene in Australia for children's literature. Her Gumnut Babies are the most famous, definitely. But she also illustrated on commission for the Department of Health in New South Wales. And her Dr. Stork and Mrs. Kookaburra were the result of those posters. Thankfully, because over time, of course, they have become stories in their own right, and really beautiful stories. I might just add that May was she's best known for her children's writing, her children's literature, but really these stories can be read by anybody. And I really recommend, no matter how old you are, really try, if you haven't read her stories, really do. They're beautiful. There's morals and ethics behind them and just lovely, gentle stories. But her illustrations are absolutely beautiful. If you haven't seen them before, please do yourself a favour and go and buy a couple of her books, particularly these coloured versions. They are absolutely beautiful. The Gumnut Babies get up to all sorts of mischief, as do Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. They get up to all sorts of mischief, and Mrs. Kookaburra is very much the motherly figure. But they really are lovely tales, and they have a lot of the native animals involved. Some of them are naughty, like the Banksia men. They're very naughty. And some of them are wonderful little stories. There they are, hanging upside down there, or on doing handstands. But they really are timeless. They are lovely stories for anybody. Anyway, I'll get back to May. So by the time she is married and she and Bertie have built their home at Nutcote as Nutcote in Sydney, the Depression is starting to kick in. And as successful as May was, books were considered a luxury, as sometimes they are now, or less so now, but certainly in those days they were a luxury. And the Depression really hit the book industry. And unfortunately, I think it is said that May's books never really recovered after that time, and she never really, she was still wealthy, I guess, for that time. I'm not to judge that, but certainly she took a beating because she wasn't selling as many of the books. But they have become, they're still published today. I was talking to a few booksellers I've been talking to them over the last few weeks, and they have found that they don't sell as much anymore of the May Gibbs books, and even going into various homewares and bookshops, it's been hard to locate and purchase any of May Gibbs books, which is sad, I think. Perhaps that's just a fashion thing. I'm hoping it is. I'm hoping that she makes a return because, like I say, I think she's timeless. Anyway, so she is still writing and illustrating. Her last book that she wrote was in 1953. She, unfortunately, before that time, her husband died in 1939. Her parents then passed away in 1941. Both of them passed away in 1941. And her good friend Renee passed away in the 1950s. So May never had children herself, even though she wrote for children. She never had any children for whatever reason. And so effectively she was, I guess, on her own, and she became a recluse. But she did write her last book in 1953, and sadly she died in 1969. I listened to an interview that she gave, a radio interview that she gave the year before she died. She was 91 at that time. She was 92 when she died, but she was 91 when she was interviewed. And she sounded so lively and so, without being, there's no disrespect intended here, but just so childlike. And I mean that in a sort of adventurous and youthful way. She even then, she said that she had more ideas for more books. So she was, even at the age of 91, still wanting to write and illustrate, which I think is just marvellous. But she, I think she really needs to make a comeback. There is the May Gibbs Appreciation Society, but there's also her home, Nutcote, is open to visitors, and we will visit the home perhaps next year sometime, fingers crossed. I'd like to visit and take you through. There is the trust, I think it is, that sells a lot of May Gibbs paraphernalia and books, things like makeup cases and baby clothes. Even I did see recently in one of the large department shops a mug, a coffee mug with May Gibbs illustrations on it. So there are bits and pieces around, but she's not as, I guess, popular as she once was. I do recommend that you, like, going through this book again, I have to show you, they really are just stunning illustrations. Now, I must really touch on something that came to my attention recently about May Gibbs. Like everything at the moment, there has been some murmurings about her Gumnut Baby, Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie not being Aboriginal, that they are white. They are depicted as white babies in the bush. Now, May Gibbs was a Victorian lady in Australia, and obviously an image of her time. That has to be forgiven or put in context in how she was drawing. I think today, if she was drawing, she would have Aboriginal children in the bush. I have no doubt about that at all. But she was, as I say often, a product of her time. And the fact that she was fascinated and promoted Australian flora and fauna should be recognised and promoted in itself. I don't want to get political. I am very much an advocate for Indigenous history and Indigenous culture. Absolutely. We don't see enough of it in Australia, and I would like to see more. But I really don't want to downplay May Gibbs's role in promoting Australia. I think for her time, she was an amazing woman, and her illustrations really did a lot at that time for Australia. That cannot be, admittedly, it was colonial Australia, but it was still depicting the flora and fauna. And one thing that I really have to say here, well, a couple of things really, but one thing is she was an advocate for conservation in Australia. She was also made a life member of the R.S.P.C.A. here in Australia, but she was a big conservationist, big. So that has, for her time, that was really forward thinking. So I encourage you to, once again, to read her books, to buy them and to read them, and even any of her artwork, if you can, or her printed works of her illustrations, but also anything to do with May Gibbs. Because those proceeds also from her books, what happened was when May Gibbs passed away in 1969, her will gave the copyright of all her works to what was then known as the New South Wales Spastic Society for Children, and also for another society for children, which I can't quite remember, but I'll put it in the description box below. So any of the proceeds to any of her works goes to those societies. I think the Spastic Society is now called the Society for Disabled Children, I think it is. Again, I will put those details in the description box below. But very much at the forefront of those types of things. So looking after children with disabilities, looking after the environment, and animals, being a life member of the R.S.P.C.A. Much to be applauded about May Gibbs. I think her imagination and her illustrations and her dedication to Australia really have to be discussed more and promoted more. So please, buy a book, read the stories. The one thing I must say about May Gibbs before I sign off, in one of these books, my reading glasses, which she makes clear, there are two things, and this will show you the conservation side of May Gibbs. In these books of Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie, and I think it's the Gum Up Babies as well, she insisted that on the front there was this quote. And it says, if you can't read it, it says, "Humans, please be kind to all bush creatures and don't pull flowers up by the roots." So even then she was really making clear that conservation was important. The other thing she says, which I absolutely agree with, and I present all children's books to you, and I will in the future, because I think it's important that as adults we go back to our childhood, and if we didn't have a playful childhood or a pleasant childhood, then at least visit this to really incite your imagination and your sense of adventure, and even just your sense of wonder in the world. But this is what she says to encourage adults to do that. And I quote, "For young eyes, brown eyes, blue eyes, and all hearts that will never grow old, full of pictures of funny bush things, and, well, just look inside and see." So from that, I understand May Gibbs to really be saying, you don't have to be a child or a young person to read her books and appreciate them and get something out of them. You can be an adult and do the same thing. And look, I try to read books that are designed for young ones, young adults, children's books, just to teach myself to stop and see the wonder in the world, because as adults we can become cynical, we can become bogged down with paying bills and making schedules. But when you go back to a childhood or to the world of children and young adults, it can be exciting. It can really switch on your sense of adventure and your sense of the love of the world, the natural world and the world in general. So May Gibbs, again, ahead of her time. You know, just because it is a book for children or a book for young adults does not mean it is exclusive to that age group. Books written for children are written so that children can read them, or young ones or young adults can read them. It's not prohibiting adults to read them. And May Gibbs encourages you to read them. Not just her books, but I actually, that quote applies to all books designed for children or written for children and young ones. No matter what your age, at least once a year, read a book that was written for children. And I think you will discover another world. I hope you do. Anyway, I will leave you for today. I would love to think that if you haven't already, that you will go out and buy or borrow from the library a book written and illustrated by May Gibbs. So until next time, I wish you well. I wish you great happiness. I wish you good reading with any book that you're reading at the moment, and good health. Bye for now.